Early on in my theological education, I ran nearly head-on into my Hebrew Bible professor, Dr. Rodney Kenny. When I entered the class, Dr. Duke was already behind the lectern. And I would have sworn that he was 7 feet tall. Huge, huge, towering figure. Until right after the lecture was over. And then he stepped down off his box and he was here. And since I was in front, it struck me funny and I laughed. And it was not a beautiful experience thereafter. But anyway, it was his job to share with us an introduction to wisdom literature. And he gave us a brief overview of the genre. In the Hebrew Bible, that is what we call the Old Testament, there are 5 books within this category: Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, which are collections of books. And then you find Job and the Song of Songs, also known as the the Song of Solomon. Now, these books contain poetry and hymnody, like Psalms, wise sayings, like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and general material with an emphasis on understanding and attaining wisdom, especially in our relationships with God and the people of God, like those we find in the book of Job. Wisdom literature focuses upon what it means for us as human beings to please God. Now, according to the wisdom writers, you find it basically all the way through Scripture. It's a thread that runs from front to back. Everyone who pays heed to biblical wisdom will become wise. And with that, my professor drew our attention to the book of Job, saying it actually was written in the beginning in play form, based upon one family's experience with God and Satan. Now, he suggested to us that there was actually bits and pieces of Hebrew humor scattered through Job, which to that point I had neglected to see. But he said that it was especially obvious if you were an ancient Hebrew person, when it came to God giving Satan permission to literally destroy a family to prove a point. The Hebrew people would not have believed that of God, and I hope we don't either. Now, Dr. Duke told us that if we got hung up there, we missed the point of the entire book. The point he suggested, from an ancient perspective anyway, was threefold. First, God's actions are beyond our understanding. Secondly, God's really not looking for our permission for him to do anything. And third, sometimes bad things happen, even to really good people. How do we respond to them? And who do we blame when these things happen? Now, we'll dig into that a bit more here in a moment, but before we do that, let's take a moment to quiet our hearts and be in prayer together. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning for fellowship and friendship and the amazing love that we share not only for each other, but certainly and absolutely with you. But we know each person in this room this morning, well, they're here for a reason. And that's not to hear me. That's to get a word that they can use in their life and in their faith from you. So I pray this morning that you send a spirit of openness to us. Open our hearts and our minds and our ears to the words we're about to hear. And I pray for a special boon this morning, that I can find a way to get out of the way so that it's not my words, your people here, but yours. Amen. Now, friends, having been in a pulpit some 30 years, man and boy, It seems to me that one of the greatest difficulties in life is coping with suffering when it touches us and the people we love. Now, there is a popular understanding that has floated through the church for thousands and thousands of years. If you really love God and you do your best to serve Him, your life will be free from suffering. Well, it's been around for a long time, but it's dead wrong.
Amen.
Sometimes the opposite is true, isn't it? Some of the greatest heroes in the Bible endured tremendous suffering. Besides Job, most of us have heard from a guy named Jesus. And the same is true today. Some of God's most precious people suffer the most. Now, to be clear, the suffering that we're talking about in Job's trials aren't the very human trials that most of us suffer. The passing away of a loved one, especially if they're very old or very sick. Or even the kind of passing that deals with perhaps the military or war or police officers. It's a very dangerous line of work. Life is finite, and violence exists everywhere. These things happen to human beings, and though there is certainly grief in such loss and separation, the kind of grief we find in this book is grief that is so total, so unexpected, so senseless, and so overwhelming that I most often relate it to some of the horrific disasters that happened in the world. Things like what took place on September the 11th, 2001. When those planes crashed into the World Trade Center in New York City, most of us who are a little bit older remember exactly where we were when that happened. And on that day, some 2,996 souls headed off to work one day, like they did every day, and they never came home again. Or the earthquake that happened more recently in Haiti, which was much worse on the scale of human loss. Now, just this past week, I read an article by a pastor by the name of Brett Blair, and he talked about this terrible disaster. Just before sunset, on Tuesday, 12 January 2010, as people were living life, doing the things that people always do at the end of the day, they were spending time with their family. They were eating dinner. They were having a glass of wine on the veranda, relaxing. A magnitude 7 earthquake rocked the island country of Haiti. They had no idea of what was coming. I mean, how could they? The loss of life was catastrophic, with some estimates ranging upwards of 200,000 people lost and an estimated 3 million people affected by the event. And the horrible irony, it seems to me, is that Haiti was already considered by many to be the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. They lived in incredible poverty already, and then this happened. Now, Blair said that as he watched television and listened to the radio and talked with people in his community, he was struck by the number and the frequency of the questions that he heard. Questions you probably ask. Why? Why do such things happen? How can there be such evil? Where's God? What can I do? And how will those people ever recover? Now, friends, questions are hard to answer in tragic times, aren't they? But we ask them anyway. Now, if you were to take a tour of the Bible, you'd find that one book has a disproportionate number of questions compared with every other book. Guess which one I'm talking about? The book of Job, absolutely. According to one online site, let me say right up front, I did not count all the questions in the Bible. It was online. But the book of Job has some 332 questions in its 42 chapters. More than double the number found, for instance, in the book of Psalms, which has 150 chapters. Now, why do you suppose the book of Psalms has so many questions? Well, it seems to me that one of the reasons, at least, is that Job deals with me, not them. Have you ever noticed that when something horrible happens and it's way over there and it's those people and it's way out of our purview, that there is sadness, there is loss, there is mourning, but it's not the same thing as if it happens to you. And that's what happens in Job. It's talking about this family. In verse 1 of this book, God describes Job as a righteous man, greater than all others. And then in verse 10, Satan says the only reason Job is faithful in the first place is because God had protected it. Job got special treatment. He said if trouble ever hit the big whiner Job, you'd see the real nature of Job. He would curse you to your face. So suddenly, without warning, and for no other reason than his being blameless and upright, his family and his livelihood, everything he held precious and sacred, it's gone. In the middle of the business of everyday life, two rogue groups conduct a raid, stealing Job's livestock and killing all of his servants. And then his family is lost when a mighty wind sweeps in from the desert and collapses the house, killing everyone in it. And it happened without warning. It was unwarranted. It was unexpected. In one day, in one afternoon, Job lost everything he held clear. So as I read Blair's story, it seemed to me that in many ways the events of the disaster in Haiti were echoed in the story of Job. And why would that be? Because even though some 4,000 years separate the two events, life, and by life, I mean the things that make life meaningful, well, these things, it turns out, haven't really changed significantly at all. We all must make a living of some kind. We all love our families. We all want security. We all want a home and food and clothing. And we don't believe major calamity will ever strike us. So what do we do when tragedy does strike us and we lose what means the most to us? Well, mostly, it seems to me, based on experience largely with other people, we do what Job did. We go numb. And when people encourage us to get back on our feet, we stumble through life lost for a season. We mourn. We ask, why? Why? Now, Job was silent when he heard the first two reports, that his business and livestock had been wiped out. But when he received the news that his children were lost, he got up and tore his robe, and he fell on his knees, and he cried out, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return." In other words, everything that had meaning for his life was now gone. He had nothing at birth, and he had nothing now. So Job felt that his life was over. Some of us have been there, haven't we? Mourning is a part of a powerful process of learning to deal with personal loss. It gives us strength in the moment, and it reveals our soul. It reminds us that we are not alone in suffering, and it nudges us to reach out to others who hurt or are trying to help us heal. But after we've mourned for ourselves and for others, we begin asking other questions, important questions. Questions like, well, where do we go from here? Where do we stand now? How can I help? And perhaps we also wonder, how can we stop this from ever happening to us again? And it's that last question that's the tricky one, isn't it? Scripture said that Job had a hedge of protection, a barrier which God placed around him but then took away, allowing Satan to do his best or his worst with Job. It's the ancient Hebrew way of saying that even the best of us are not immune to bad things. Just because we're good or rich or famous doesn't mean we're protected from bad. Not in this life. The writer of Job understood this, but at the moment Job himself could not. He was too caught up in his personal loss and grief. Now, friends, I'm guessing that when disaster strikes, we've all heard good Christians say it was God's will, and that we just need to have faith that something good will come out of it. Now, I hesitate to speak for God, even when I'm standing behind this pulpit. And I confess it may well be a weakness in my theological position on human suffering, but I cannot bring myself to suggest anything other than something horrible happened, and God didn't do it. See, bad things happen, even to good things good people like us. We can't pin monumental natural disasters on God. We need to learn what Job eventually learned, that none are immune to pain or failure or loss. It's part of being human. But it seems to me that there is a final question asked in times of great loss. Where is God when these things happen to us? Later in the book, Job wants to know why he's suffering and why God has allowed this to happen. He doesn't know. He doesn't understand. He finally gets his answer when God visits him from out of a storm and asks Job 86 questions. I didn't actually count those either. It was in the book. 25% of the questions in the entire book of Job are asked in 4 chapters where God interrogates Job. Job's had his say. God has his now. Now listen to some of his questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you understand. Do you have an arm like God's? And can your voice thunder like his? Do you give the horse his strength or clothe his neck with flowing mane? And Job had no answer for these, so he finally shuts up. And he realizes that he is a person, a mere human being, that he cannot possibly comprehend the meaning of the events around him. In the end, Job repents in dust and ashes, and you'll hear more about that in the coming weeks. So, where do you suppose God was? At sunset? On that horrible evening in Haiti? Where was God when the spate of copycat school shootings took place in our school? And where was God when the World Trade Towers were bombed, or disasters and wars and sickness of all kinds took lives and destroyed property? Where was God when our loved one was lost unexpectedly? Or when the stock market crashed and we lost our retirement and everything we own? Now, friends, you need to hear this, if nothing else, today. God was not hiding. He was not taking a nap. He was not on vacation. in any of the difficult moments of our lives. Friends, I am comforted that God can make good happen even out of bad, but He is not responsible for the pain in our lives. He does not cause our suffering. So, maybe this one time, I'll tell you where God was when the earth shook and the floods came, or the shootings and the bombings happened, and when we suffered great personal loss. God was right there in the last moments when loved ones took our hands or whispered, "I love you." He was right there under the rubble in New York City and Haiti, holding on to those who weren't going to make it. He was there in the aid that flows in in the aftermath of such things. He's there handing out sandwiches, bottles of water, and compassion. He's there in the searchers, trying to find the children that are unaccounted for. His are the hands holding the scalpel and the shovel. He's near the heart of all in the face of tragedy, who actually do love their neighbors. And He stands beside those of us who look for and to Him, not for any kind of easy answers to these questions, because in the end there are no easy answers. And tragedy teaches us that we are mortal and fully dependent upon Him and our neighbors, the neighbors Jesus reminds us to love. Now, I confess to you, I don't know how people do in the face of such tragedy and loss, but by the grace of God, they do. Some rise above the pain, and even in the midst of suffering, they find God, who was there all along. Maybe as we study the book of Job together over these next few weeks, we'll find the answer to how these happen. See, it's only natural for us to ask questions, and we do. And Job did. Spoiler alert. You'll notice one thing God did not do in the book of Job is to tell Job the reason for his suffering. See, God doesn't answer every question for us, does He? Some things we can only answer for ourselves. So rather than tell Job the reason for his suffering, instead, God assured Job of His presence and His love and His wisdom and His power. Job learned the hard lesson that when everything is stripped away from our lives, all that remains to us and with us is the mighty presence of God. Suffering tests our faith. Suffering can strengthen our faith, or it can shatter. We have to make the choice. Suffering will either drive us into God's arms or it will cause us to walk away. And we've all seen people do just that in tough times. And Job reminds us that in the end, we must trust God in His infinite wisdom. We need to trust in God's perfect love for us. Seek God's presence in the midst of our pain, because God, too, knows pain. Our Lord, who still bears the marks of crucifixion, stands with arms open wide, prepared to receive us and hold on to us as long as is necessary. Amen. Will you please stand and join in the hymn of response?